The sky was still gray when the first sound of steel echoed across the valley. A massive medieval army stretched across the fields like a moving ocean of iron and banners. Thousands of knights in heavy armor stood shoulder to shoulder. Horses snorted in the cold air, while rows of archers tightened their bowstrings. War drums pounded slowly, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Nearly 10,000 warriors had gathered. Their king stood on a wooden platform overlooking the army. His crown glinted faintly in the weak morning light as he raised his sword across the valley. Something impossible had appeared. 100 soldiers stood in a tight formation. They wore strange uniforms made of dark fabric and armor the medieval warriors had never seen before. Their helmets were smooth and curved, covering their faces with black glass. They carried weapons that looked nothing like swords or spears. The king narrowed his eyes. "Who are they?" he asked. None of his generals had an answer. The soldiers were calm. Too calm. Their commander, Captain Daniel Hayes, slowly lifted a pair of binoculars and scanned the horizon. Thousands of armored warriors, cavalry, archers, infantry, an entire medieval army ready for battle. Behind him, one of his men spoke quietly. "Sir, that's a lot of them." Daniel lowered the binoculars. "Yeah," he said calmly. "About 10,000. A nervous laugh escaped another soldier. "We're only 100. Daniel looked at the men around him. Elite Special Forces soldiers, the best of the best. Every one of them trained for impossible situations. But this was something else entirely. They had been on a routine mission only hours earlier. A classified operation involving experimental technology. Something had gone wrong. One moment they were in the desert running a tactical simulation. The next moment, a blinding flash of light swallowed everything. And now they were here. Standing in the middle of the Middle Ages, the soldiers quickly established a defensive position on a small hill. From there, they could see the entire valley. The medieval army began moving. Lines of infantry marched forward with shields raised. Archers formed ranks behind them. Cavalry gathered on the flanks. The ground trembled as thousands of boots and hooves pounded the earth. Daniel spoke into his radio. "All right, listen up. We don't know how we got here, but that army down there thinks we're enemies." One of the soldiers muttered, "Pretty sure we are." A few chuckles broke the tension. Daniel continued. "We hold this hill. Defensive formation. Controlled fire only." The soldiers quickly spread out, taking positions behind rocks and small ridges. Rifles clicked as they were loaded. Scopes adjusted. Machine guns mounted. From the medieval side, the king watched carefully. He had never seen armor like this. And those weapons, they were holding strange metal sticks. One of his generals stepped forward. "My king, shall we send riders to question them?" The king shook his head slowly. No, he could feel something was wrong. These men were not afraid. Even though they were outnumbered 100 to 10,000, they stood there calmly, waiting. The king raised his sword high into the air. The war drums stopped. For a moment, the entire valley fell silent. Then he shouted a single word. "Charge!" The army roared. Thousands of knights and infantry surged forward like a tidal wave. Horses thundered across the fields. Archers lifted their bows. From the hilltop, the modern soldiers watched quietly. One soldier whispered, "Here they come." Daniel raised his hand. "Hold fire." The medieval army got closer, closer. The ground shook violently now as cavalry galloped toward the hill. 500 meters, 400, 300. The soldiers tightened their grips on their rifles. Daniel waited until the cavalry filled his sights. Then he lowered his hand. Fire. The sound that followed shattered the valley. A storm of gunfire exploded from the hill. Automatic rifles roared. Machine guns thundered. Within seconds, the front line of cavalry collapsed. Horses screamed as bullets tore through armor, that had never been designed to stop modern weapons. Knights were thrown from their saddles, shields shattered, steel helmets cracked. The medieval army had never heard such sounds before. Explosions of gunfire echoed like thunder. Dozens of knights fell instantly. Then hundreds. Panic spread through the front ranks. The soldiers kept firing in controlled bursts. Every shot was precise. Every target dropped. From the king's platform, disbelief spread across the faces of his generals. What sorcery is this? The king stared in horror as wave after wave of his army collapsed before even reaching the hill. Archers tried to respond. Thousands of arrows filled the sky. But the distance was too great. Most arrows fell harmlessly short. The soldiers continued firing. Machine guns ripped through entire groups of charging infantry. Within minutes, the once proud charge had turned into chaos. Bodies covered the field. The survivors slowed, unsure what to do. No enemy in history had ever destroyed armored knights this easily. Daniel spoke calmly into the radio. "Keep your spacing. Watch the flanks." A soldier reloaded and looked through his scope. "Sir, they're regrouping." Down in the valley, the king had finally realized the truth. This enemy was unlike anything the medieval world had ever faced, but he still had thousands of men, and numbers could still win wars. He raised his sword again. This time, he ordered the entire army forward. 10,000 warriors surged toward the hill. From the soldier's perspective, the battlefield suddenly became far more dangerous, because even with modern weapons, 10,000 enemies was still an overwhelming force, and their ammunition was not infinite. One of the soldiers checked his magazine and spoke nervously. "Captain, if they keep coming like this..." Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the battlefield. "I know," the medieval army was learning. Instead of charging in tight formations, they began spreading out across the valley. Archers moved closer. Cavalry began circling the hill. Thousands of warriors slowly surrounded the small group of soldiers. The battlefield had changed. The first attack had failed, but the real battle was only beginning. The medieval army moved with a new kind of caution now. What had begun as a confident charge had turned into a terrifying lesson. Hundreds of armored knights now lay scattered across the valley floor. Horses wandered riderless, and broken shields were half buried in the dirt. But the army was far from defeated. 10,000 warriors still stood ready. On the hilltop, Captain Daniel Hayes studied the battlefield through his binoculars. The enemy had changed their tactics. Instead of rushing blindly, they were spreading out across the valley, slowly surrounding the hill. They were learning, and that made them dangerous. "Sir," one of the soldiers said quietly, "they're trying to flank us." Daniel nodded. "I see it." On both sides of the hill, groups of cavalry had begun moving wide, attempting to circle behind them. At the same time, thousands of infantry soldiers advanced slowly with shields raised. Behind them, the archers were moving forward as well. Daniel lowered the binoculars. "All right, listen up," he said calmly. "They're adapting. That means we adapt faster." He pointed toward the left side of the hill. "Team Alpha, cover that flank. If those riders get behind us, we're in trouble." The soldiers moved quickly into position. Even though they were heavily outnumbered, their training showed. They moved like a machine, each man knowing exactly where to go. Below them, the medieval king watched with growing frustration. He had expected the strange warriors to panic. Instead, they moved with discipline. One of his generals leaned closer. "My king, their weapons strike from far away. Our men cannot reach them." The king clenched his jaw. "Then we will drown them in numbers." He raised his hand and signaled to the archers. Thousands of bows lifted toward the sky. A moment later, the command was given. "Loose!" A dark cloud of arrows filled the air. From the hilltop, the soldiers saw it instantly. "Arrows!" someone shouted. Daniel reacted immediately. "Take cover." The arrows rained down across the hill. Most of them struck rocks or dirt, but a few clattered against the soldiers' helmets and armor. One arrow stuck into a backpack. Another bounced off a rifle. The range was getting closer. The archers had moved forward. Daniel grabbed his radio. "Suppress those archers." Two machine gunners immediately shifted their aim. Their weapons roared to life. Bullets tore across the valley toward the archers' lines. Dozens of bowmen dropped instantly as the terrifying power of modern firearms ripped through their ranks. The remaining archers scattered in panic. But the king had expected losses. What mattered was time. While the soldiers focused on the archers, something else was happening. The cavalry had almost reached the rear of the hill. One soldier suddenly shouted, "Contact behind us." Daniel spun around. Through the dust, dozens of armored riders were charging up the slope from behind. "Open fire." Rifles cracked again. Several horses collapsed mid-charge, sending their riders crashing into the ground. But this time, some of them kept coming. The distance was much shorter now. One knight managed to reach the top of the hill before a burst of gunfire knocked him from his saddle. The soldiers realized something important in that moment. If the enemy got close enough, their advantage would shrink. Daniel spoke quickly. "Fall back 10 meters. Keep distance." The soldiers adjusted their positions, stepping backward while continuing to fire. More cavalry tried to climb the hill. Each one was met with a wall of bullets. Still, the battlefield was becoming more chaotic. Thousands of infantry soldiers were now climbing the slopes from the front. Their shields formed a moving wall of iron. Bullets slammed into the shields, punching through wood and metal alike, but there were simply so many of them. One soldier muttered under his breath, "They just keep coming." Another soldier checked his ammunition. "Captain, we've already burned through a lot of rounds." Daniel knew that was the real problem. 100 soldiers could hold a position against incredible odds, but only if they had enough ammunition. He looked across the battlefield again. The medieval army was slowly tightening the circle around the hill. They were sacrificing hundreds of men just to get closer, and eventually someone would break through. Daniel spoke calmly, but firmly. "Conserve ammo. Controlled shots only. No panic firing." The soldiers nodded. They had trained for situations like this, though none of them had imagined fighting an entire medieval army. Below the hill, the king saw that his strategy was working. His army had taken heavy losses, but the strange warriors were no longer unstoppable. Their thunder weapons fired less frequently now. That meant something. "They are weakening," the king said. One general nodded. "My king, we should send the heavy cavalry." The king turned toward a group of armored knights waiting behind the army. These were his best warriors. Elite knights clad in the strongest armor available. Hundreds of them. He raised his sword. "Send them." A horn echoed across the valley. The elite knights lowered their lances. Then they charged. The ground shook as hundreds of heavily armored horses thundered forward together. From the hilltop, the soldiers immediately noticed the new attack. Daniel raised his binoculars again. His expression hardened. "Here comes the main force." The elite cavalry moved much faster than the earlier attacks. And this time they were spread out, harder targets. A soldier asked nervously, "Orders, sir?" Daniel lowered the binoculars. "Machine guns first. Aim for the horses." The machine gunners took aim. When the cavalry reached 200 meters, the guns opened fire. The effect was devastating. Horses collapsed mid-gallop, throwing knights violently onto the ground. Several riders flipped through the air as bullets tore through armor and flesh, but the charge didn't stop. More knights pushed forward. The sound of gunfire echoed continuously across the valley. Rifles joined the machine guns. Dozens more cavalry fell. Yet somehow, a few riders kept getting closer. 50 meters, 40, 30. One knight managed to reach the top of the hill and swung his sword wildly before. 3 soldiers fired at once, dropping him instantly. Another rider tried to break through on the right flank. A grenade exploded beneath his horse, sending both rider and animal crashing into the dirt. The hilltop was beginning to look like a battlefield from another world. Modern weapons against medieval warriors. Smoke drifted through the air. Gunfire cracked endlessly. And still, the medieval army kept advancing. A soldier wiped sweat from his forehead. This is insane. Daniel checked the remaining ammunition crates. His expression darkened. They had already used nearly half their supply, and the medieval army still had thousands of soldiers left. Down in the valley, the king was watching carefully. His knights had taken terrible losses. But something important had happened. Some of them had reached the hill, which meant the strange warriors were not invincible. The king turned to his generals. Prepare the final assault. If thousands of men attacked from every direction at once, even these mysterious warriors would fall. High on the hill, Daniel seemed to sense the same thing. He looked across the battlefield again. The medieval army was reorganizing. Lines of infantry were forming on all sides of the hill. Cavalry regrouped behind them. Archers prepared another massive volley. This time, the entire army was preparing to attack together. One soldier whispered, "Sir, they're going all in." Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. He took a deep breath and spoke into the radio so every soldier could hear him. "All right, boys. Looks like round 2 is about to start." The valley fell strangely quiet again. 10,000 warriors stood ready. 100 soldiers prepared their weapons. And both sides knew the next attack would decide everything. But just as the medieval army prepared to move, something unexpected appeared on the horizon. The soldiers on the hill noticed it first. At the far edge of the valley, beyond the dust and banners of the medieval army, something strange was moving. A soldier squinted through his scope. "Captain, you seeing that?" Daniel lifted his binoculars again. At first he thought it was just dust blowing across the hills. But then shapes began to appear, dark shapes, moving fast. For a moment, Daniel thought they might be more cavalry from another kingdom joining the battle. But then sunlight reflected off something metallic. His eyes widened. Wait. Another soldier leaned over. "What is it?" Daniel lowered the binoculars slowly. "I'm not sure." Down in the valley, the medieval king noticed the disturbance as well. His generals were pointing toward the horizon. The strange shapes were growing larger every second. The army paused. Even the war drums stopped. The ground began to tremble again. But this time it wasn't horses. The sound was deeper, louder. A distant thunder that grew stronger with every passing moment. The soldiers on the hill watched silently. Then one of them suddenly laughed. "No way." Another soldier grabbed the binoculars. "Oh my God." Daniel finally spoke. "Well, looks like we're not the only ones who came through." Across the horizon, a line of massive armored vehicles rolled into view. Modern military trucks, armored personnel carriers, and behind them, 2 tanks. The sound of their engines echoed across the valley like monsters waking from sleep. The medieval army had never seen anything like it. Thousands of soldiers stared in confusion as the steel machines advanced across the fields. The king looked horrified. "What creatures are these?" One of his generals whispered, "My king." They move without horses. The armored vehicles kept coming. Dust clouds followed behind them as they sped toward the battlefield. On the hill, the soldiers were grinning now. A soldier slapped another on the shoulder. "Looks like backup showed up." Daniel wasn't smiling yet. He was thinking. "Everyone hold position," he ordered. The medieval army began to panic. Rumors spread instantly through the ranks. Some believed the machines were dragons made of iron. Others thought they were demons. But the king forced his army to stand firm. No retreat. He shouted. He had already lost hundreds of men. He would not lose the battle to fear. He raised his sword again. Forward! The final assault began. Thousands of warriors charged the hill from every direction. Shields raised. Swords ready, archers fired another massive volley of arrows. The sky darkened again. On the hilltop, Daniel gave the order. Fire! Rifles roared once more. Machine guns thundered. The front ranks of medieval soldiers collapsed instantly. But there were simply too many of them. More warriors climbed over the fallen bodies and continued charging up the slopes. Arrows struck the ground around the soldiers. One arrow hit a soldier's shoulder armor and bounced away. Another stuck into the dirt just inches from a machine gunner. The distance between the armies shrank rapidly. 100 meters. 80. 60. A soldier shouted, "They're getting close." Daniel grabbed a grenade and pulled the pin. Grenades. Several soldiers hurled explosives down the hill. The blasts ripped through groups of charging infantry. Dirt and bodies flew into the air. Still, the attackers kept coming. From below, the medieval warriors were screaming battle cries. They believed they were finally close enough to kill the strange invaders. A group of knights reached halfway up the hill before being cut down by rifle fire. Another wave of infantry pushed forward behind them. One soldier reloaded his rifle quickly. "Captain, they're not stopping." Daniel fired another burst down the hill. I noticed. Suddenly, a knight broke through the gunfire and reached the edge of the hilltop. He raised his sword and charged toward one of the soldiers. The soldier reacted instantly, firing twice. The knight dropped just a few steps away. But now more warriors were climbing the slope behind him. For the first time, the medieval army was dangerously close. The soldiers were forced to fight at shorter distances. Gunfire echoed nonstop. Shell casings scattered across the ground. Smoke and dust filled the air. The hill had become a storm of noise and chaos. And then a deafening explosion echoed across the valley. Everyone turned. One of the tanks had fired. The massive shell slammed into the middle of the charging army. A blast was catastrophic. Dozens of medieval soldiers were thrown through the air. The ground itself seemed to shake. For a moment, the entire battlefield froze. Then the second tank fired. Another explosion tore through a group of knights preparing to charge. The armored vehicles roared forward now. Machine guns mounted on their roofs opened fire. Streams of bullets tore through the medieval formations. From the perspective of the ancient warriors, it looked like the gods themselves had joined the battle. The steel monsters crushed anything in their path. Horses panicked and ran wildly. Soldiers dropped their weapons and fled. The king watched in horror. His army was collapsing. Thousands of men who had bravely charged moments earlier were now running for their lives. The soldiers on the hill took advantage of the chaos. "Push them back," Daniel shouted. Rifles continued firing as the remaining attackers retreated down the slopes. The armored vehicles arrived at the base of the hill. Their engines growled like beasts. One of the vehicles stopped near the soldiers. A hatch opened. A modern soldier leaned out and shouted, "Need a ride?" Several of the men laughed with relief. Daniel climbed down the hill to meet them. "Where the hell did you guys come from?" The driver shrugged. "Same place you did, I think." Behind them, the battlefield was a disaster. The once mighty medieval army had completely broken formation. Thousands of warriors were running across the valley, trying to escape the steel monsters and thunder weapons. The king's generals begged him to retreat. "My king, the army cannot stand against these demons." The king looked across the battlefield one last time. Bodies covered the fields. Horses ran without riders. And the strange warriors stood untouched on the hill. Slowly, he lowered his sword. The order to retreat was given. War horns echoed across the valley. The medieval army began withdrawing. What had started as a confident attack by 10,000 warriors had turned into a nightmare. But Captain Daniel Hayes wasn't celebrating yet. He looked toward the horizon again. The same horizon where the armored vehicles had appeared. Because something else was there now. Something much larger. The ground trembled again. But this time, even the modern soldiers looked confused. One of them whispered slowly, "Captain, that's not one of ours." Far in the distance, an enormous army was approaching. And this one looked even bigger than the last. For a moment, nobody on the battlefield spoke. Even the engines of the armored vehicles seemed quieter as every soldier stared toward the distant horizon. The dust cloud was enormous, far bigger than the one created by the first medieval army. Captain Daniel Hayes slowly raised his binoculars again. At first he saw only movement, but as the dust settled slightly, shapes began to appear. Thousands of them, then tens of thousands. Daniel's expression changed instantly. "That's not possible." One of the soldiers beside him asked nervously, "What do you see?" Daniel handed him the binoculars. The soldier looked. 2 seconds later, he lowered them slowly. Captain?" "Yeah, that's a lot of people." The armored vehicle commander climbed out of his hatch and grabbed the binoculars next. His reaction was even worse. "Oh, man." Daniel crossed his arms. "How bad?" The commander looked back toward the horizon again before answering. "Way worse than the last army." Down in the valley, the retreating medieval army had stopped running. They were staring at the same thing. From their perspective, an even greater force was approaching from the east. Thousands of banners waved in the wind. Huge columns of infantry stretched across the plains. War drums thundered louder than before. But this army looked different. Their armor was darker. Their shields were larger, and their banners carried the symbol of a black wolf. One of the modern soldiers asked, "Who are they?" Daniel shook his head. "No idea." But the medieval king knew. His face turned pale as he recognized the banners. "The Northern Empire." One of his generals whispered in terror, "My king." "Their army is said to number over 30,000. The king clenched his fists. They had marched south to conquer this land, but now their greatest enemy had arrived, and worse. The mysterious warriors with thunder weapons were standing directly in the middle of the battlefield. From the hilltop, the soldiers watched as the massive army spread across the plains. The scale of it was unbelievable. 30,000 soldiers. Maybe more. Infantry marched in endless lines. Thousands of cavalry rode beside them. Huge siege weapons rolled behind the formations. Catapults, ballistae, even massive wooden towers. One soldier muttered under his breath, "Yeah, that's not good." The armored vehicle commander scratched his head. "So let me get this straight." He pointed toward the retreating army. "We just scared off 10,000 medieval knights." Then he pointed toward the new army. "And now 30,000 more show up?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Looks that way." Another soldier sighed. "Worst vacation ever." The soldiers laughed briefly, but everyone understood the situation. This new army was much larger. And unlike the first one, they had witnessed what happened. From the far end of the valley, the Northern Empire army had seen the explosions, the gunfire, the steel machines. They had seen an entire army collapse in minutes, which meant they would not attack blindly. On the opposite side of the battlefield, the Emperor of the Northern Empire stood atop a massive war chariot. He was a tall man with dark armor and a wolf-shaped helmet. His generals gathered around him. "My Emperor." "The Southern army is retreating." The Emperor nodded slowly. "I see that." One of the generals pointed toward the hill. "And those warriors? They are not from this world." The Emperor stared through a long grass spyglass. He watched the armored vehicles moving near the hill, watched the strange soldiers carrying thunder weapons. Then he smiled slightly. "Interesting. Unlike the Southern king." The Emperor was not afraid. He was curious. He lowered the spyglass "Prepare the army." The generals hesitated. "My emperor, we do not know what those weapons are capable of." The emperor laughed. "No weapon can stop 30,000 men." His voice became cold. "Today we conquer this land, and whatever strange warriors stand in our way." Back on the hill, Daniel was already planning. He gathered the soldiers around one of the armored vehicles. "We've got a serious situation." One soldier asked, "How many do you think?" Daniel answered honestly, 30,000? Maybe more." A few soldiers whistled. "That's insane." The armored vehicle commander leaned against the tank. "Well, we've got 2 tanks, 4 APCS, and about 300 extra soldiers." Daniel nodded. "That helps." But he knew the truth. Even with modern weapons, 30,000 enemies was a huge problem, especially in an open battlefield, and their ammunition supplies were still limited. One soldier suddenly pointed toward the retreating army. "Hey!" They stopped running. Everyone turned. The Southern Army had stopped retreating. Instead of leaving the valley, they were reforming their lines. The king had realized something. If the Northern Empire conquered the land, his kingdom would be destroyed anyway. So he had made a desperate decision. His army would fight again. But this time, they would fight alongside the mysterious warriors. A messenger carrying a white banner slowly rode toward the hill. The soldiers raised their rifles cautiously. "Hold fire," Daniel said. The rider stopped several meters away. He removed his helmet and shouted, "My king wishes to speak." Daniel stepped forward. "About what?" The messenger pointed toward the massive approaching army. "That." Daniel glanced toward the horizon again, then back at the messenger. "Tell your king, we're listening." The messenger rode back down the hill. Within minutes, the medieval king himself approached with a small group of guards. He stopped at a safe distance. The king looked at Daniel carefully. "You are not demons." Daniel smirked slightly. "Good to know." The king pointed toward the approaching army. "That force will destroy us all." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, we noticed." The king continued, "My army has fought them before. They are ruthless." Daniel crossed his arms. "How many?" 30,000 warriors." Daniel sighed. "That's what we thought." The king lowered his sword slowly. "My men will fight beside you if you help us stop them." For a moment, neither side spoke. 2 completely different worlds, standing together on the same battlefield. Finally, Daniel looked back at his soldiers, then at the armored vehicles, then at the massive army approaching across the valley. He turned back to the king. "All right?" The king's eyes widened slightly. Daniel continued calmly, "We fight together." The king nodded slowly. "But understand this. My warriors fear your thunder weapons." Daniel smiled. "Trust me. So do our enemies." Across the valley, the Northern Empire army had finished forming its battle lines. 30,000 warriors stood ready. War drums thundered like an earthquake. The emperor raised his sword high, and the largest battle this world had ever seen was about to begin. For several long seconds, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. 2 armies now stood across the battlefield. On one side, the enormous force of the Northern Empire stretched from one hill to the other like a dark ocean of steel and banners. Their soldiers stood in perfectly organized formations, shields locked together, spears rising like a forest. Behind them, rows of cavalry waited impatiently, their armored horses stomping the ground. And further back, enormous siege machines creaked as they were rolled into position. Catapults, ballistae, massive wooden towers taller than houses. It was clear that this army had come prepared to conquer an entire kingdom. But on the other side of the valley, something completely unexpected had formed. The battered Southern army had reassembled itself. Nearly 9,000 surviving warriors stood once again with shields raised and swords ready. But this time they were not alone. Behind their lines stood the 100 modern soldiers. And beside them, the steel machines, the tanks, the armored vehicles, the thunder weapons. The medieval soldiers still stared at them with a mix of fear and awe. Many of them had witnessed what those weapons could do. Entire groups of knights had fallen in seconds. Yet now those same weapons were standing beside them. Captain Daniel Hayes climbed onto the side of one of the armored vehicles and studied the battlefield again. The scale of the enemy army was staggering. 30,000, he muttered quietly. The vehicle commander stood beside him. Maybe more. Daniel sighed. Well, at least this time we're not alone. Behind them, the medieval king was shouting orders to his generals. His army quickly formed defensive lines along the hills and valley entrance. Shield walls formed. Spearmen gathered in dense formations. Archers moved to higher ground. For the first time in history, a medieval army and a modern military force were preparing to fight side by side. One of the modern soldiers watched the medieval warriors nervously. Think they'll actually hold? Daniel answered honestly. They don't have a choice. Across the valley, the emperor of the Northern Empire studied the strange formation through his spyglass. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He had expected to face the southern army alone. Instead, he now saw those mysterious warriors standing beside them. The emperor slowly lowered the spyglass. They have formed an alliance. One of his generals asked, "Should we wait, my emperor?" The emperor shook his head. No. He raised his sword slowly. No enemy survives when the empire marches. His voice echoed across the command platform. Prepare the advance. Immediately, the massive army began moving. War drums exploded into thunder. 30,000 soldiers marched forward. The ground trembled under their boots. From the hilltop, the soldiers watched the enormous army begin its advance. One of them whispered, "Here we go again." Daniel grabbed the radio. All units ready? The tank engines roared louder as they rolled forward slightly. Their cannons slowly rotated toward the advancing army. Machine guns clicked into position. The medieval soldiers tightened their shield walls. Archers drew arrows. The battlefield had become eerily quiet again, except for the distant drums. Then the emperor dropped his sword. Charge. The sound that followed was unlike anything the valley had ever heard. 30,000 warriors roared as they surged forward. The earth shook violently as cavalry began galloping. Thousands of shields slammed together as infantry advanced. Arrows filled the sky like a dark storm cloud. From the hilltop, Daniel calmly raised his hand. Wait. The enemy army kept getting closer. 2,000 meters. 1,500. 1,000. The soldiers gripped their weapons tightly. Medieval archers loosed their first volley. Thousands of arrows flew across the battlefield. Most landed harmlessly in front of the Allied lines. Then the enemy infantry reached 800 meters. Daniel lowered his hand. Fire. The tanks fired first. The explosion of the tank cannons shattered the air like thunder from the heavens. 2 massive shells slammed into the front ranks of the advancing army. The blasts were devastating. Entire groups of soldiers disappeared in clouds of dirt and fire. But the army did not stop. Behind them, thousands more warriors kept advancing. The machine guns opened up next. Streams of bullets ripped across the battlefield. Dozens of soldiers fell instantly. Then hundreds. The modern rifles joined in. Gunfire echoed nonstop across the valley. From the perspective of the Northern Empire soldiers, it was like charging into a storm of invisible blades. Men collapsed without warning. Armor shattered. Shields exploded apart. Yet the army kept moving forward. Because there were simply too many of them, the emperor watched calmly. Continue the advance. His generals obeyed. More infantry poured forward. Archers moved closer and fired another massive volley. This time, the arrows began landing among the southern soldiers. Several shields rattled as arrows struck them. One soldier fell with an arrow in his leg. But the shield wall held. Behind them, the modern soldiers continued firing. Grenades exploded among the enemy ranks. The tanks fired again. More explosions tore through the battlefield. Still, the army kept coming. 600 meters. 500. The Emperor signaled again. Suddenly, hundreds of cavalry riders broke away from the main formation. They spread out across the battlefield, galloping toward both sides of the Allied lines. Daniel saw it instantly. "They're trying to flank us again." He grabbed the radio. "APCs, intercept those riders." The armored vehicles roared forward across the field. Their mounted machine guns unleashed devastating fire. Horses collapsed mid-gallop. Knights were thrown violently onto the ground. But some riders kept coming. A group of heavily armored cavalry managed to reach the southern shield wall. Swords clashed against shields. The first real hand-to-hand combat began. The medieval soldiers fought fiercely. Spears stabbed forward. Swords flashed in the sunlight. But behind them, the modern soldiers were still firing. Bullets tore through the attackers trying to break the line. The combination was terrifying. An army that had trained for sword combat, supported by weapons from the future. Even the Northern Empire soldiers began to hesitate. The battlefield had become something completely new, something no one had ever seen before. On the command platform, the Emperor watched carefully. His army had already lost hundreds of men, maybe thousands. Yet his expression remained cold. "Release the heavy cavalry." A horn blasted across the battlefield. From behind the army, a new formation began moving. Thousands of elite knights. Fully armored, massive war horses covered in steel plates. The most powerful cavalry force in the empire. They lowered their lances. Then they began to charge. From the hilltop, Daniel saw them immediately. "Oh, that's not good." One of the soldiers looked through his scope. "How many is that?" Daniel answered quietly. 3,000? Maybe more. The ground began shaking again. 3,000 heavily armored knights thundered toward the battlefield like a moving avalanche. Even the southern soldiers looked nervous now, because they knew what that kind of cavalry charge could do. The tanks slowly turned their cannons toward the charging force. Daniel spoke calmly. "All right, let's see how they handle this." The distance between the armies shrank rapidly. 400 meters, 300, 200. Then the tanks fired. The explosions ripped through the charging cavalry. Horses and riders were thrown violently through the air. Machine guns opened fire again. Dozens more knights fell. But there were too many. Hundreds of cavalry riders kept charging through the chaos. Their lances pointed directly at the shield wall. The southern soldiers braced themselves. Daniel suddenly shouted into the radio, "Everyone focus fire." Every rifle on the battlefield opened up. The sound of gunfire became deafening. Knights collapsed one after another. Yet somehow, a few of them were still getting closer. 100 meters. 50. 20. The first riders smashed into the shield wall with tremendous force. Wood splintered. Men were thrown backward. The battlefield exploded into chaos. And for the first time since the battle began, the Allied lines started to bend. Not break, but bend. And far across the battlefield, the Emperor smiled. Because he could see something the others couldn't. Behind the cavalry charge, another force was moving forward. Quietly, slowly, hidden by the chaos of battle. A force that could change everything. But Captain Daniel Hayes hadn't seen it yet. The impact of the cavalry charge shook the entire battlefield. Thousands of armored riders slammed into the southern shield wall like a storm of iron. Wooden shields splintered under the force of the impact. Some soldiers were knocked backward, crashing into the ground as horses pushed through the line. For the first time since the battle began, the Allied defense was under serious pressure. Swords clashed violently. Spears stabbed forward. War cries echoed across the valley. But behind the shield wall, The modern soldiers reacted instantly. Close targets. One of them shouted. Rifles fired rapidly now. At this short distance, every bullet was devastating. Knights who had survived the charge suddenly collapsed as gunfire tore through their armor. Horses screamed and reared as machine gun fire cut through the chaos. The battlefield had become a brutal mix of ancient and modern warfare. One moment a medieval knight swung his sword in close combat. The next moment he dropped instantly as a rifle cracked from 10 meters away. Captain Daniel Hayes moved quickly along the line, shouting orders. Keep the line steady. Don't let them break through. Grenades exploded among clusters of enemy soldiers, trying to force their way through the shield wall. The blasts threw dirt, armor, and weapons high into the air. Slowly, the cavalry charge began to lose momentum. Dozens of dead horses blocked the path behind them. Fallen knights struggled to stand before gunfire cut them down. But even as the charge failed, something else was happening. Farther back across the battlefield, the hidden force that the Emperor had deployed was still moving forward. Thousands of soldiers in dark cloaks advanced quietly through the dust and smoke. Unlike the main army, they carried smaller shields and short swords, but on their backs. Each one carried a large round object wrapped in cloth. They moved carefully, staying low behind the chaos of battle. The Emperor watched them through his spyglass. Soon, he whispered. Back on the hill, Daniel finally noticed movement far to the left side of the battlefield. He lifted his binoculars again. At first he thought they were simply more infantry advancing, but something about their formation looked different. Hold on, he muttered. He zoomed in further. The soldiers were moving much slower than the rest of the army, and they were heading toward the armored vehicles. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Those guys aren't charging. One of his men asked, What are they doing? Daniel lowered the binoculars. I don't know yet, but I don't like it. He grabbed the radio. APC-3, watch your left flank. There's a group moving toward you. The driver of the armored vehicle replied. Copy that. The machine gun turret slowly rotated toward the approaching group. From a distance, the cloaked soldiers looked harmless. They were not charging. They were not even raising their weapons. They simply kept advancing quietly. Then suddenly, one of them threw the object from his back. It arced through the air and landed near one of the armored vehicles. A second later, boom, the explosion rocked the ground. The APC shook violently. Everyone nearby turned in shock. Captain! Someone shouted. Daniel looked again through his binoculars. Now he saw it clearly. The cloaked soldiers were throwing explosive clay bombs. Primitive explosives, but powerful enough to damage vehicles. Damn it, Daniel muttered. He grabbed the radio. All units, those guys have explosives. More bombs flew through the air. Another explosion blasted dirt against the side of a tank. The vehicles were built to survive much worse. But if enough explosives landed in the right place, they could still cause serious damage. The machine guns opened fire immediately. Bullets ripped through the cloaked soldiers. Dozens fell instantly. But there were hundreds more behind them, and they kept throwing bombs. Explosions erupted across the battlefield. One bomb landed close to a group of Southern soldiers, sending them diving to the ground. Another detonated near an ammunition crate, scattering dirt everywhere. The Emperor watched with satisfaction. His hidden troops were doing exactly what he wanted. While the main army fought the shield wall and gunfire, the bomb throwers would destroy the enemy's steel machines. Without those machines, the mysterious warriors would lose their greatest advantage. Back on the hill, Daniel realized the danger quickly. If they take out the vehicles, we're in serious trouble. He turned to several soldiers. Take a squad and wipe those guys out. 8 soldiers immediately broke away and moved down the left slope. They spread out as they advanced, rifles ready. The bomb throwers noticed them too late. Gunfire cracked across the field. One after another, the cloaked soldiers dropped before they could throw their explosives. Within minutes, the entire group was wiped out, but the damage had already been done. One PC had taken heavy damage from multiple explosions. Smoke was pouring from its engine. The driver climbed out coughing. "Vehicle's done," he shouted. Daniel cursed quietly. They had already lost one of their vehicles. Across the battlefield, the Emperor noticed the destroyed APC. A thin smile appeared beneath his Wolf-shaped helmet. "Good," he said softly. But the battle was far from decided. The main fight was still raging across the valley. Thousands of Northern Empire soldiers were pushing forward. The shield wall was holding. But barely. The tanks fired again. Massive explosions tore through enemy formations. But every time a group of soldiers fell, more stepped forward to replace them. The battlefield had become a sea of chaos. Smoke, dust, screaming horses, clashing swords, gunfire echoing like constant thunder. Daniel checked the ammunition count again. The numbers were dropping faster than he liked. One soldier ran up beside him. "Captain, we're burning through ammo fast." Daniel nodded grimly. "I know. If the battle lasted too long, even modern weapons wouldn't matter. They would simply run out, and 30,000 enemies would still be standing." He looked across the battlefield again. The Emperor's army was massive, disciplined, and relentless. Daniel realized something important in that moment. This battle could not be fought like a normal defense. If they stayed here, eventually the enemy numbers would overwhelm them. They needed something bigger, something that would break the enemy army completely. But what? As Daniel thought quickly, another massive explosion echoed across the valley. Everyone looked toward the sky. High above the battlefield, a distant roaring sound was growing louder. The modern soldiers immediately recognized it. One of them shouted in disbelief, "No way!" Daniel slowly looked up, and for the first time since arriving in this strange world, he smiled, because cutting through the clouds above the battlefield, something incredibly powerful was approaching. And when the Emperor of the Northern Empire saw it, even he would realize that this war had just become something far beyond anything he had imagined. The roaring sound in the sky grew louder every second. At first, the medieval soldiers thought it was thunder. Some of them even looked toward the clouds, expecting a storm to appear above the battlefield. But the modern soldiers knew exactly what it was. Several of them began smiling. One soldier laughed loudly. "Oh man, now that's perfect timing." Captain Daniel Hayes stared up into the sky as the sound grew into a deafening roar. Through the clouds, a dark shape appeared, then another. 2 military fighter jets tore across the sky at incredible speed. The valley shook with the thunder of their engines. For the medieval armies below, the sight was beyond imagination. Enormous metal birds screaming across the sky faster than any creature alive. Thousands of soldiers froze in fear. Some dropped their weapons and covered their ears. Others fell to their knees, believing the gods themselves had arrived. Even the Emperor of the Northern Empire stared upward in shock. "What are those?" The jets screamed across the battlefield once, circling above the valley. Their shadows raced across the ground like giant predators. Inside one of the cockpits, the pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Ground team, this is Falcon 1. We finally found you guys." Daniel grabbed his radio immediately. "Falcon 1, you have no idea how good it is to hear you." The pilot laughed. "We saw the fireworks from miles away." "Looks like you started a war." Daniel glanced across the battlefield. "Yeah, a big one," the pilot replied calmly. "Well, good news. We brought some very bad news for your enemies." The jets climbed higher into the sky and turned sharply. The Emperor watched them carefully. His generals looked terrified. "My Emperor!" Those creatures fly like dragons. But the Emperor was not afraid. He was furious. "Archers!" he shouted. Thousands of archers raised their bows toward the sky. But the jets were already far above them. And then the first missile launched. From the ground, it looked like a streak of fire falling from the heavens. It slammed into the center of the Northern Empire army. The explosion was unlike anything the battlefield had seen. A massive fireball erupted across the field. Hundreds of soldiers were thrown violently into the air. The shockwave knocked nearby warriors off their feet. The ground itself seemed to shake. For several seconds, the entire battlefield went silent. Then the second jet fired. Another missile streaked downward. Another explosion tore through the enemy ranks. Panic spread instantly through the Northern Empire army. Men began running in every direction. Horses screamed and bolted across the valley. The Emperor's carefully organized formations collapsed into chaos. Back on the hill, the soldiers watched with wide eyes. One of them whistled. "Yeah, that'll do it." Daniel grabbed the radio again. "Falcon 1, focus on the enemy center. Break their command structure." "Copy that," the pilot replied. The jets turned again for another attack run. From the Emperor's command platform, the approaching aircraft looked like unstoppable monsters. His generals shouted desperately, "My Emperor, we must retreat." But the Emperor refused. No. He pointed his sword toward the Allied forces. "Advance! Kill them!" Yet even as he shouted, another missile struck nearby. The explosion destroyed several siege weapons and sent soldiers flying in all directions. The Emperor's chariot nearly tipped over from the blast. Now even his personal guards looked terrified, because the battlefield had changed completely. Before, they had been fighting soldiers. Now they were fighting the sky itself. The jets roared overhead again. Machine guns mounted beneath their wings opened fire. Streams of bullets ripped through clusters of soldiers. Entire lines collapsed instantly. Back near the Allied position, the Southern soldiers stared in amazement. One of them whispered to another, "Are those gods?" The other soldier shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but they are on our side." Daniel watched the battlefield carefully. The enemy army was breaking. Thousands of soldiers were fleeing across the valley. Others were throwing down their weapons in surrender. The Emperor's grand invasion had turned into a disaster. But the Emperor himself refused to accept defeat. Standing atop his damaged chariot, he raised his sword again. "Hold the line!" A small group of elite guards gathered around him. Even as soldiers fled around them, these warriors stood firm. The Emperor pointed toward the hill. "Charge!" Several hundred loyal knights obeyed instantly. They formed a tight formation and began riding toward the Allied lines. It was a desperate attack, but a determined one. Daniel saw them coming. "Last push," he muttered. He turned to the soldiers beside him. "Let's finish this." The tanks rolled forward down the hill. Their cannons locked onto the approaching knights. Boom! The first shell exploded in the middle of the charge. Half the formation disappeared in fire and dust. Machine guns opened up again. Knights fell one after another. Still, a few riders kept charging, their armor covered in dust and blood, their swords raised high. They were the Emperor's last warriors. 20 meters. 10 meters. One knight managed to reach the edge of the battlefield before rifle fire finally brought him down. Within seconds, the charge was over. Silence slowly spread across the valley. A massive Northern Empire army had completely collapsed. Thousands of soldiers were fleeing. Others dropped their weapons and surrendered. And at the center of the battlefield, the Emperor stood alone beside his damaged chariot. His armor was scratched and covered in dust. His once proud army had vanished around him. Captain Daniel Hayes slowly walked forward with several soldiers beside him. The tanks stopped behind them. The Emperor watched them approach. His expression was calm now. "You are not warriors of this world," he said. Daniel shrugged slightly. "You could say that." The Emperor looked across the battlefield one last time. Smoke rose from burning siege weapons. Dead soldiers lay scattered across the valley. His invasion had failed completely. Slowly, he dropped his sword. It hit the ground with a dull metallic sound. My war is over. The Southern king soon arrived with his guards. He stared at the defeated emperor. This battle will be remembered for centuries. But Daniel wasn't listening, because something strange was happening again. The same bright light that had brought them here suddenly appeared in the sky once more. It grew larger, brighter. The modern soldiers looked up. One of them said quietly, "I think it's happening again." Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah. Within seconds, the bright light swallowed the sky above the valley. Wind rushed across the battlefield. Dust swirled everywhere. The tanks, the armored vehicles, the soldiers. All began to glow in the strange light. The medieval warriors watched in shock as their mysterious allies slowly began to disappear. The Southern king stepped forward. "You are leaving?" Daniel looked at him. "Looks like it." The king lowered his head respectfully. "You saved our kingdom." Daniel smiled faintly. "You guys did most of the fighting." The light grew brighter. The modern soldiers began vanishing one by one. Within seconds, the tanks disappeared. The armored vehicles vanished. Finally, Captain Daniel Hayes was the last one standing. He gave the king a quick nod. "Good luck." Then the light swallowed him too. And just like that, they were gone. The battlefield fell silent. Only the medieval warriors remained. The Southern king looked across the valley where the impossible battle had taken place. Thousands of enemy soldiers had been defeated. An entire empire had been stopped, and the warriors who had saved them had vanished like ghosts. For generations to come, stories would spread across kingdoms. Stories of the day when thunder warriors fell from the sky, the day when metal beasts crushed armies, and the day when fire from the heavens destroyed an empire. But far away, in a modern military base, a bright flash of light suddenly appeared in the middle of a training field. Soldiers, tanks, and armored vehicles reappeared exactly where they had vanished. Captain Daniel Hayes looked around. The desert training ground was back. Everything looked normal again. One soldier laughed in disbelief. "Did that really just happen?" Daniel looked toward the sky, where the portal had disappeared. Then he smiled. "Yeah, and somewhere in another time, 30,000 warriors would forever remember the day they fought an army from the future." The desert training field was silent for several seconds. No one moved. No one spoke. The 100 soldiers who had just returned from the impossible battle simply stood there, staring around in disbelief. A moment ago they had been standing in a medieval valley surrounded by thousands of warriors. Now they were back at the military base. Same sky, same sand, same equipment. It felt unreal. One soldier slowly removed his helmet and wiped sweat from his face. "Okay, someone tell me I didn't just imagine that." Another soldier looked at the tank beside him. "Well, the tank definitely remembers it." The tank's armor was scratched and covered with dirt from the battlefield. Even one of the APCs still had a burn mark from the medieval explosives. This hadn't been a dream. It had really happened. Captain Daniel Hayes slowly walked across the training ground while military personnel rushed toward them from nearby buildings. Alarms had been triggered when the strange energy surge appeared. Within minutes, several high-ranking officers arrived. One general looked shocked. "Captain Hayes, where the hell have you been?" Daniel paused for a moment. He thought about everything that had happened. The battlefield, the medieval armies, the tanks rolling across the valley, the fighter jets screaming through the sky, and the moment when the entire army from another time had collapsed. Finally he answered, "You probably wouldn't believe me if I told you." The general crossed his arms. "Try me." Daniel looked toward the horizon for a moment. "We just fought a war. About 600 years in the past." The officers stared at him. For a few seconds, no one said anything. Then one of the soldiers nearby started laughing. Soon several others joined in. The general shook his head slowly. "You're serious?" Daniel nodded. "Completely." The soldiers began unloading their gear, while engineers inspected the vehicles. Every piece of equipment showed signs of combat. Bullet marks, burn damage, dirt from an ancient battlefield. Even fragments of medieval arrows were stuck in some armor plates. There was no doubt they had been somewhere else, somewhere in the past. Hours later, the soldiers gathered in the base mess hall. Everyone was still talking about what had happened. One soldier leaned back in his chair. 30,000 medieval soldiers. Another laughed. "And we actually beat them." A third soldier shook his head. "Not just us. Those southern warriors fought like crazy." Daniel sat quietly for a moment. He remembered the king standing on the battlefield, the moment when the medieval army and the modern soldiers had fought side by side, two completely different eras, working together. One of the soldiers asked him, "Captain, do you think they're okay?" Daniel thought about it. After the Northern Empire was defeated, the Southern Kingdom had been safe. Their biggest enemy was gone. "They'll be fine," he said finally. They earned their victory. Back in the medieval world, the valley had slowly returned to silence after the mysterious warriors vanished. The Southern soldiers were still standing there, staring at the empty battlefield where the metal machines had once stood. The king himself walked slowly across the field. He stopped where the final battle had ended. Around him lay the remains of the Northern Empire army. Broken shields, discarded weapons, destroyed siege machines. His generals approached carefully. "My king, the enemy has completely retreated." The king nodded. "They will never return." One general looked toward the sky. "The Thunder Warriors? Will we ever see them again?" The king smiled faintly. "I do not think they belong to our time." He looked across the valley where the tanks had fired their cannons, where the jets had brought fire from the heavens, where the modern soldiers had stood beside his warriors and fought an impossible battle. "History will remember this day," he said. The soldiers around him nodded in agreement, because they had witnessed something no one else in the world had ever seen. Warriors from the future, weapons that sounded like thunder, iron beasts that moved without horses, and fire falling from the sky. The king turned toward his army. "Gather the wounded. We return home." Slowly the surviving warriors began marching away from the valley. Behind them, the battlefield of the impossible war faded into the distance. But the story would spread. Travelers would speak of it in distant cities. Bards would sing about it in taverns. Children would grow up hearing legends about the day when soldiers from another world appeared and saved an entire kingdom. Some people would believe the stories. Others would call them myths. But the warriors who had stood there that day would know the truth, because they had fought beside those thunder soldiers. Back in the modern world, night had fallen over the military base. Captain Daniel Hayes stood alone outside the hangar where the vehicles were being repaired. The stars were bright above the desert sky. One of the fighter pilots walked over to him. Falcon 1, the same pilot who had helped turn the battle. He leaned against the railing beside Daniel. "So, medieval war, huh?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Yeah," the pilot chuckled. "I've flown a lot of missions, but that one was definitely the weirdest." Daniel looked toward the stars again. "Imagine explaining that in a mission report." The pilot laughed. "Good luck with that." For a moment, they both stood there quietly. Then the pilot asked something serious. "Do you think it could happen again?" Daniel thought about the bright light that had opened in the sky, the strange portal that had taken them to another era. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But if it does." He looked back toward the hangar where the soldiers were working. "I guess we'll be ready." The pilot nodded. After a few seconds, he walked away. Daniel remained there for a moment longer. Somewhere in the world's long history, An entire empire had fallen because a group of modern soldiers accidentally traveled through time. And somewhere in that ancient kingdom, people were probably still talking about the day when the sky opened and warriors from the future arrived. Daniel smiled to himself. History was full of strange mysteries. Maybe this was one of them. Maybe centuries from now, people would still argue about the story. Did it really happen? Or was it just a legend? Only 100 soldiers in the modern world knew the truth. And they would probably never forget it, because they had seen what happens when two completely different eras collide. When swords and shields face rifles and tanks. When ancient warriors fight beside soldiers from the future. The clash of eras. And that battle would remain one of the most unbelievable stories ever told. If you enjoyed this epic story and want to see more incredible battles like modern versus ancient armies, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next Clash of Eras adventure.